Hello, everyone. Welcome to this session of the Sustainable Care Annual Conference on Migration and Care Work. We are going to have my name is Agnes Turnpenny and I work at the University of Kent. We are going to have three presentations today, and without any further delay, let's go to our first presenter, who's Professor Hildegard Theobald. Hildegard is a professor of organizational gerontology at the University of Vechta in Germany. Her main research areas of interest include international comparative welfare research in the area of long-term care policies, formal and informal care work, professionalization, and migration. She's particularly interested in the intersection of gender, socioeconomic class, and ethnicity-based inequalities. So, Hildegard, please deliver your presentation.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to my presentation. Could you show the first slide, please? The involvement of migrant care workers in home care settings in Germany, dynamics of inequalities. The next slide, please. With my introduction, I will give first user information on the background of the issue I will discuss here. With the establishment of the long-term care insurance in 1995-96, Germany made public universal long-term care support available by an emphasis on family care provision, but now publicly supported and complemented by professional care services. Within this context, a complex mixture of different types of paid care work in three distinct home care settings developed, related to simultaneously increasing employment of migrant care workers and the development of patterns of inequalities between and within the home care settings. The next slide, please. In my presentation, I will focus on analysis of the impact of the policies in the home care sector on the development of these distinct home care settings and the related types of paid care work and the allocation of care workers based on migration status to these types of paid home care work in an intersectional perspective. I will show you my conceptual framework and I will give you an overview on the empirical findings. The next slide, please. Thank you. The next slide, please. I will start my conceptual framework with the approach of Daly of 2000, where she analyzes the effects of care policies on the situation of formal and informal carers. She distinguished in her concept between structure, process, and outcomes. Structures are the policies in place, the institutional dimensions, underlying cultural values. Embedded in this structure, you have a process of construction of care activities across the private, family, and public border and within the sectors. And as outcomes, she analyzes the effects on the situation of formal and informal carers from an inequality perspective. The next slide, please. In the home care sector, several policies are in place. I will here select the long-term care policies, professionalization, employment, and migration policies. The policies are responsible for the construction of the care infrastructure across and within the sectors and the allocation of different groups among care workers in the home care settings. The next slide, please. I will give now a short overview on the social policies in the area in Germany. The next slide, please. I will start with the most relevant scheme, the long-term care insurance. The long-term care insurance is based on the idea of explicit familialism, that is, family care should be publicly supported and only complemented by professional services. Germany long-term care insurance is a universal policy scheme. It's generous on a medium level, for example, with regard to the level of private payments, and it offers different types of benefits, cash payments, and different services based on choice. The next slide, please. Embedded in this structure and these policies, home care services have been constructed across private-public borders. In Germany, that is, professional home care services, which are mainly oriented towards nursing care or bodily care services, and two types of services organized within private household, that are live-out services, which are mainly providing household-oriented services, and live-in services, that is, services which are provided mainly by migrant care workers and include comprehensive care and household-oriented services. The next slide, please. If I come to the professionalization employment policies, I will show you first the basic approach of these policies, and then I will show you shortly the impact of the role of state, market, and family. If we look at the basic approach, we can say in Germany, we have an emphasis on 3 years occupational training programs, but we have a neglect of professionalization efforts for less trained care workers, and we have very limited care workers who have completed BA study programs. If we look at the impact of the different sectors, in Germany, the state is responsible for financing long-term care insurance. Mainly, about 30% of the costs are private costs, and for the regulation of training programs, training requirements, and employment forms. Professional care services in Germany are delivered on a market basis, in the care market. We have found in our empirical research, just as in other countries, we have in particular deprofessionalization processes for care workers on lower levels. That means the market impedes professionalization of activities for care workers on lower levels, but they have regular but typically low employment and professionalization standards. If we come to the family, we have an unclear boundary between informal family care and paid care work. And if we have some policies in place, they're typically defining low employment and professional standards. So next slide, please. Finally, I will show you the role of the shape of our migration policies. In Germany, we have 2 types of policies in place. The first are EU policies related to the Single Market Project, and we have national policies. The EU has, within the Single Market Project, stipulated several directives or regulations to foster economic activities across the borders. So there's a right of free movement for services across the border of the member states. Firms can temporarily post their workers in further EU countries, and there's a common labor market for residents of the EU countries. If I come to Germany, I have to say that for residents in new EU member states, this common labor market is only opened up since 2011. If you come to national policies, we have also more emphasis on the international recruitment of care workers since 2010, but it's mainly of skilled care workers. So we have several reforms, for example, the reform of employment regulations, and we have several agreements with selected countries. So next slide, please. Now I will show you the outcome. The next slide, please. The outcome of the effects I will measure based on the idea of precarization. So I will compare the working situation or the employment situation on the level of precarization. Doing it, I use the concept of marginalization, which has been created by Castell. Castell said that marginalization means a process of increasing levels of destabilization and degradation of labor market situations and related social security. That means levels of precarization. He defines 3 zones of labor market situation. You have a zone of integration, where you have a stable labor market situation and comprehensive social rights. You have a zone of vulnerability, which is much more insecure labor market situation. And you have even a zone disabilitation life situation where the employees are excluded from the regular labor market. The next slide, please. Also relevant for our research are not only these different types of precarization, it's also important that Castell defines that the positions, the different zones are interconnected, so they're dependent on each other. And he says that political and economic actors are responsible for the development on an individual level and for the societal consequences. The next slide, please. If I analyze inequality-related effects, I use the concept of intersectionality. I here define care work or home care work as female-dominated area, but which is characterized by further social divisions, such as skill levels is one indicator for social class and migration status for ethnicity. First, I define that inequalities and their intersection are constructed in a distinct social context. The process of construction are emerging on macro, meso, and micro levels. Here relevant, of course, are the macro levels, that mean social policies, and the construction of the home care labor market, but also relevant, but which I cannot show really empirically now, is a meso level, that means the policies and daily practices within the organizations, the care organizations, or the private households. The next slide, please. Now we come to the empirical part. And this empirical part, I will show you an overview of the findings, and I will show you the overview for every distinct home care setting. So I would like to start with professional care services. Next slide, please. And the next slide. Okay. If I look at professional care, home care service in Germany, of course, there's a high female dominance. About 85% of people are women. If you look at the professional employment system, I can see that about 50 to 60% of the care workers has completed a 3 years occupational training. And about 20% of the care workers have only marginal part-time jobs. That means insecure labor market situation. We have the opening up of the sector and an increasing employment of migrant care workers since 2010. It's dependent on the EU regulations, and on the other schemes since 2013. If I look what happens in the sector, I can say that in home care, we have now more migrant care workers, but mainly skilled migrant care workers. Unskilled migrant care workers have only access or mainly access in Germany to residential care services. But if they're employed in home care, they have a comparable employment situations. But we have found also indicators for disparities. So, for example, with regard to development opportunities, or there are also areas of conflicts in daily care work, so ideas on care work or professional roles. The next slide, please. Then I would come now to private households, that is the services which are organized within private households. Here we have live-in and live-out services. I will start with live-out services. The next slide, please. If we take live-out services, we have even a stronger female dominance. About 90% and more are women. It's done by migrant, but also German nationals, and we have here no defined training program. If I look at the employment situation and defined by the level of precarization, then we see it's a widespread grey market activity. That means, according to Castells, are excluded from the regular labor market. Since 2003, we have established a mini-job scheme in private households that is characterized by low wages and low social security standards. So it's a regular scheme, but it's a very insecure scheme. We have better schemes in place, but they're only rarely used. If I looked at the impact of the change in migration policies, you can see that between 2003 and 2010, the mini-job scheme were mainly used by German nationals. Since 2011, we have an opening up of the scheme for workers or for care workers from Eastern European countries, for example. And you can relate it to the EU common labor market, which is now opened up. We have also changed that mainly the German and non-German nationals are mainly older women now. That indicates that younger women have more or better chances on the regular labor market in Germany now, and they are employed in these live-out services longer. The next slide, please. Finally, I come to live-in comprehensive care services. This type of services has been developed since the end of the 1990s. It's done by female migrant care workers from Eastern European countries mainly, from Poland, Slovakia, Romania, or Hungary. If I look at the employment situation, you see it's a high level of precarization, even higher than in live-out services. So it's a widespread grey market activity. If we have regulations, they're mainly used EU regulations, but they're used to construct labor market situations below German standards. We have all the better schemes in place, but they're only very rarely used. If I look at changing situations for migration, you see, of course, that female migrant care workers are now able to have access to the regular German labor market because it has been opened up since 2011. But if I already explained the standard employment scheme for households is only rarely be used, there's no chance. But if we have surveys and ask live-in care workers, then they say, above all the younger among them say, that they use this activity as a springboard for employment outside private households in further area of the labor market. The next slide, please. Now I would like to come to my conclusion. I have showed you that embedded in interaction of long-term care, professionalization, employment migration policies, in Germany, the home care infrastructure became divided into 3 distinct care settings: based on different regulations, non-regulations, or non-enforced regulations, and characterized by distinct patterns of precarization. So next slide, please. If you look at the allocation, you see that the allocation of care workers is based on skill levels and migration status in this female-dominated area. If you look at the situation of skilled migrant care workers, they are mainly allocated to professional home care services and have more or less stable labor market situations. But most of the migrant care workers in Germany are allocated to care work within private household, either to live-in or live-out services, and they are characterized by difficult employment situations. If you look at the change in migration policies in Germany, you see that, of course, skilled migrant care workers have better employment opportunities, and although the other migrant care workers have a little bit increased the situation or improved the situations, so they can make use more of the mini-job stream as live-out care workers, or on the individual level, they try to leave the private household and to find employment in other areas of the German labor market. So next slide, please. Finally, I would like to say thank you for attention. And I would say also that this paper has been developed within the framework of the project Sustainable Care, Connecting People and Systems, and within the work package on home care and migration. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the fascinating presentation. And still staying with the topic of living migrant care workers, but moving to England, I would like to welcome our next presenter, Professor Shereen Hussein. Shereen is Professor of Health and Social Care Policy at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. She is the founder of the Manara Network and visiting Professor of Applied Statistics at King's College London and Adjunct Professor of Applied Statistics and Population Science at the University of Southern Queensland, Australia. Shereen's research interests include aging demographics, long-term care demands, care and health workforce, and migration. So Shereen, please deliver your question.
Thank you very much for the nice introduction, Agnes. I'm Shereen Hussein, and I'm a Professor of Health and Social Care Policy at the London School of Hygiene Tropical Medicine. And I have the pleasure today to speak to you about some of our recent work from the Sustainable Care program of work, and specifically I will be looking at living care workers in the UK, which is a relatively new phenomena in the UK, but it's a very fast-growing area. And more specifically, I'm interested to look at the well-being of living care workers and the significance of place as a construct of that well-being. Next slide, please. So just to acknowledge that this work has been facilitated by a grant from the ESLC, and it's a program of work led by Professor Sue Yendel at the University of Sheffield. And also I acknowledge the contribution of Albert Todazira in collecting some of the information. And this work is a joint collaboration with my colleague, Agnes Turnpenny, who is working with me on this work package. Next, please. So basically, live-in care work is a significant, as I said, a small segment of the home care market in the UK. So traditionally, the home care market and the ideology of care in general did not rely much on live-in care workers, not like some other countries, particularly in Southern Europe, like Italy and Spain. However, we have been seeing quite an increase in the type of support that is provided live-in, which basically people, support workers or care workers moving in with the family to provide care, whether with the older person alone or if there is another member of the family to provide care at home. And that usually happens through segments of time, and then they take a break and then maybe they come back to the same person or another person. And usually this is facilitated by the whole progression of personalization and personal budget, but also because the UK care market is quite a mixed market, and the funding of social care is mixed. So you have quite a considerable proportion of people who are receiving care and organizing care are self-funders and doing this through their own funding and own kind of out-of-pocket, while others who are eligible, both needs and means assessed by the local council, could be provided with a personal budget, and then through this personal budget they are able to purchase services. And some of them, particularly those with high and complex needs like with dementia or physical disability, usually tend to go for live-in care workers more recently, particularly. And this type of work then becomes quite emotionally and physically demanding, because you are dealing with a specific group of service users who have high need demand. And it is quite different from other services provided in people's home, particularly in how this is regulated and shaped. Anything that is provided by an agency or another employment agency that are responsible for training becomes a responsibility of the Care Quality Commission, and thus it's regulated and registered through CQC. Within the live-in care segment, we find a lot of this is privately organized and arranged within the household, and thus it doesn't become regulated. And that is an important issue in the shaping of the dynamics of the labor features of this type. And we see a lot of role of introductory agency rather than employment agency, and online platform, and also self-employment. And that leads to a lot of precarity of work and working conditions. There's a high reliance on migrant care workers, both women and men, in majority women, but previous studies have shown that this type of work also opened up opportunities for migrant men, particularly to work with men with physical disabilities, service users who have a certain level of physical disabilities, and they would prefer to have a man. But it's quite, attractive to migrant workers, particularly to do with that the accommodation is provided with it. And it is quite intense. So usually the workers spend between 4 to 8 weeks with the same client without any days off, and then they take a break, and that is quite demanding. Next, please. So this study is based on interviews with 13 migrant live-in carers, which is part of a broader set of interviews that we've conducted for the Sustainable Care Program. The field work was conducted between June 2019 and March 2020, just before the lockdown for the COVID-19. So we didn't capture much of what's happening. By that point of time, we had reached saturation of information and reached our target sample. Our sample includes 7 EU nationals and 5 non-EU nationals, and that's important in the context of the European free mobility, although of course that is going to change with Brexit and Britain exiting the EU. And then we have 1 UK national, however, that person is permanent resident in another non-EU country. And you can see that it's quite attractive to migrant workers, and particularly EU migrants, because of this kind of circular migration. They can come for a few weeks, they can go back, and we'll have a look at that one. Our sample was all except 2 white females, except 2 Black African males, and they, in the majority work, it was older clients, but 1 worked with an adult with spinal cord injuries, and 2 had a kind of a mixed clientele group. What was interesting is the age range as well of our sample. So we have quite a range from age of 38 to age of 73. And we had a range of arrival dates between 2000 to 2019. So quite, very recent people arrivals, but people who have arrived quite a long time and is still doing this type of work. there was a high prevalence of self-employment, as we said, because that facilitates the relationship with the service user, because effectively the service user is the employer. However, if the care worker is self-employed, then all the responsibilities lies in become the responsibility of the care worker. And we have conducted interviews and recorded them and transcribed them and analyzed them thematically on in vivo. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to talk quickly about the embodied nature of care labor. So what was really interesting for us when we were doing this analysis is how people basically provide this care and how that impacted on them, and they embody it as part of their the lived experience, and particularly for home care and lived-in care. As we mentioned briefly, this is very physically demanded and emotionally demanding because of the type of clientele, but because of other things as well. It's because of the place of the work and the boundaries between what is work and what is personal. And also it becomes like you're part of a family group. You're part of, not seen as work by everybody. So if you are with that person, are you a companion? Are you a worker? Are you part of the family? And then we see here that gender has a key discourse. And unfortunately, we didn't have many men, but previous studies shows that actually the experience of men and women in this situation can be quite different and quite interesting to look at. I have provided here some quotations, so maybe if you enlarge this slide, and I don't expect you to read all of them, but it's really about whether are they doing work, do they expect to be paid the minimum wage? Is it going to be calculated based on the number of hours they work, or is it an au pair, like you are part of the family looking after a certain person, eating with them, watching telly? And these boundaries of being part of the family and being responsible and organizing things. And our participant talked about that many of these clients are quite rich, are quite big, living in big houses, and they are working around these big houses, and their responsibility become varied. So just to give you a flavor here. So if you go to the next one, please. So boundaries in live-in care. There is quite an important issues around the interrelational aspect and the multiple boundaries, whether it's formal or informal work. Is it paid, or I'm a family member? And the caring worker and the cared for, so the person that you care about becomes your employer, but also he's the place owner. And this is quite important when we think about well-being. And then it is a difference between different clientele groups. Some people are quite demanding, and they want really, as they say, as that point Gillian says in here, that they want their pound of flesh out of you. And they expect you to do different things. So you're not here just as a care worker. You can be the gardener, you can be the cleaner, you can be the dog walker. And then when the family becomes nice, where are the boundaries? Where can you draw a line between whether this is my family or whether I'm a part of the family or I am just a worker? And then you got to know them, you've got to, eat with them, you've got to stay with them, you become family. And for the well-being, this lack of boundaries is quite concerning because it's not a family and you have to change client. So next slide, please. So this really is about, you as a person, as a worker, you've been embedded in another person's life, but at the same time, you still have your responsibilities of caring somewhere else. And because of how these circular migrants happen, they kind of, and even if they are here for a longer period, they still have responsibilities and caring responsibility back home. And this all about distance and proximity, and then the place becomes virtual. So the way that they look after their families back home becomes virtual most of the time, and it happens while they are with the person they care for, or in person when they go back during their break. And we found here that actually the communication and presence and technologies are quite important, and many of them have adapted to this, distance relationship and organizing care and providing support and providing financial support. And then when you think about place and well-being, then virtual place becomes a very important element to take account of as well. Next slide, please. So when we think about place, proximity, and vulnerability, you have different dimensions of this. You've got the older person or the person that is receiving care, with the boundaries that we talked about, that sometimes it's quite blurred, but also they still have the authority and power. But at the same time, they can be quite vulnerable. So there is a risk of abuse, particularly if the care worker is the only person, the live-in care worker is the only person with that person, with the older person or the client alone. There might be some situation. But also the power relationship can be exploitative to the migrant live-in care workers. And the worker themselves, they have this lack of social support at work. So there is nobody else to talk to. They are actually isolated, and most of their contacts are virtual, and they can't really fit in whether they are part of this family, are they workers, are they outsider, are they insider, and these work personal boundaries and feeling of surveillance, so being watched, being looked at all the time, and they can't switch off, is quite takes a lot of burden on well-being. And then you get the balance between being professional but also being in a position for exploitation. And also we have seen a lot of incidents where the relationship can be good with the service users, but the family and other members of the broader family, whether it's offspring, the relationship can be tense or the other way around, and how they would be embedded within not only the older person or the person receiving care own life, but their own social network. So that creates quite a pressure. Next slide, please. So these are a bit of quotes, and it just to illustrate how in some situation actually the family surveillance can be quite intrusive. So some families use cameras. It talks about how they are offered rooms to stay in, but how these can be very difficult to set boundaries that this is my room, this is my personal space, particularly because the type of people they work with, if they have dementia, they will roam into the room, they will open it in the middle of the night, they would be thinking that there is something in that drawers, and there is nothing but their own stuff. And then how the worker's social life has to be shaped around the person's social life, whether their taste of music, their taste of food, their types of events. So it becomes quite the care worker becomes in the shadow, and they have to adapt to this sort of life. Next, please. So when we think about this, and becomes very clear that the place of work is quite an important construct of well-being. You cannot separate it from other elements of the work. So the literature on well-being at work can talk about how the work is organized, the wages, the support at work, and the environment. But there is very little on the environment. Within live-in care work, the environment and where you are embedded is quite important, and it becomes really important in relation to how this interface between work, family, and personal kind of family or personal or work time and space are separated, or in fact are merging, and how that can play with building relationships and also on the well-being of the individual. And while they need to be embedded within this assignment, this is not lasting because many of them don't know when will be the next assignment. So because of the nature of the clientele group, there is a high death rate, there is a change, there are people who might need live-in care, or there is a lot of changes in circumstances. So they don't know. They live this fluid. Some of them talked about having a suitcase, and this is their life in this suitcase, and they don't know where or when they're going to go the next step. Next, please. So these are a bit more quotations, and it's really a wonderful quote about this, the room that they offer them. So for this person, Gillian again talked about, I've had anything from the broom cupboard to beautiful double room, but do you know what? It's the same. It doesn't matter because it's not mine, and I never feel that this is my own space. And then this is a person talking about having their life in a suitcase. Next, please. So really, when we think about theorizing well-being, there is a dilemma of well-being among migrant live-in care workers. So they, in one hand, where these care workers, usually women, and are also migrants, usually in search for better well-being for themselves, but mainly for their families as well. And this displacement and externalization of well-being is really important. And having a home, having an accommodation, having a place to stay overnight is really important for the well-being. So the live-in care provides this element. However, it provided in a very compromised way, compromised privacy, dependency, and vulnerability. And it becomes very paradoxical that you achieve this security of having a place to stay, but it's not really a place that would allow you the safety and winding down and switching off. However, what we found with the vast majority of our participants, that they displace the well-being to others, to externalize it to their family. So I'm doing this, it's not for me, my well-being now is not as important, but I'm thinking about my family, my children, my husband, etc., or my parents at home, that I'm looking after them. Next one, please. So in conclusion, while there is a migrant agency is really important in shaping the increased significance of live-in care workers, and they make the choice to come to do live-in care workers because it provides certain attractiveness to it. One of it is really the place, the accommodation. And in the minds of migrant workers, this is important for their well-being. Will secure where they're staying and increase their earnings in a way because they're not spending much on accommodation. However, in reality, that doesn't really achieve the required goal. And the way that they negotiate this is by displacement of well-being, both in time and space, and how they create their own virtual spaces. That this is where I can provide my family with support, with care, within a place that I don't have any control about. Thus, there is kind of positives and negative impacts of live-in care belonging and safety. There is also the temporality and expectation and dependency. And there is also, of course, if we look at the bigger picture, when Brexit, already we are in Brexit since January, but we are in lockdown, basically, there is not much travel. Once we open up, and becomes, realize that we do need more live-in care workers because this is a growing area. We will see how that is impacted by this free mobility, because it's basically, in a lot of sense, based on this premise that people have the freedom to move, to choose, to come, and then to contribute to that specific sector. Next, please. There is a lot to be done, and we need to think about how the well-being of care workers sits within all this. And thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Shereen. Now we move to our third and final presentation by Reiko Ogawa. Reiko is a professor at the Graduate School of Social Sciences at Chiba University in Japan. Her research focuses on migrant care workers from Southeast to East Asia, mainly in Japan and Taiwan. Reiko, please deliver your presentation.
Hello, thank you, Agnes, for your kind presentation. I'm Reiko Ogawa from Chiba University, and I have been researching on migration and care for maybe more than a decade. And today my presentation is entitled Deregulation of Migration Regime and Migrant Care Workers in Japan. This is pretty much an ongoing phenomenon, but of course, due to the pandemic, it is temporarily suspended. So next slide, please. So, of course, there's the concept of the global care chain has allowed us to think beyond the nation-state framework. And if we look at Asia, especially from the East Asian perspective, the care chain is not global, but regional. So here we have this regional care chain in Asia. On the one hand, we have the Southeast Asian countries as ascending country from the Philippines, from Indonesia, from Vietnam, migrating to East Asia, that to countries and societies like Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Korea, and Japan. And as you can see, there are significant number of migrant domestic or care workers who are living in and providing care and domestic work in countries like Singapore, Hong Kong, and Taiwan. But in Korea and Japan, it is quite the picture is quite different. Next slide, please. So, Ito Pen from Toronto University argues that there are two dominant approaches to migrant care workers in East Asia. One is the liberal private market approach, and the other is regulated institutional approach. In Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Singapore, the state provide minimum public care and liberalize the immigration policies, so the families have to seek for migrants in the market to sustain their care needs. This approach is in line with the general trend in the Western countries, where marketization of care is taking place. On the contrary, Japan and Korea, the state established a public long-term care insurance, which is pretty much like Germany, which is financed by premium and tax, that ensures access to care regardless of their economic status. In these countries, migrants are highly restricted despite of the care needs. And scholarly work on comparative welfare state has been discussing convergence theses by using different indicators. Convergence can be defined as the tendency of societies to grow more alike, to develop similarities in structures, processes, and performances. I argue that there is a convergence pressure to marketize care through the acceptance of migrants, even though the basic institutional framework remains the same. Next slide, please. The background and the aim of the study is like this. And of course, Japan is the world's fastest aging society. We have like 1 in 3 person above 65 years old. The population has already started to decline, and the women's labor force participation ratio is increasing. So here comes the deregulation of migration and marketization of care, which I will explain. In recent years, there are different channels for migrants has opened up to allow them to work in the care sector. So my research question is how migrants are constructed to fit within the different channels. And secondly, what are the impact of deregulation of migration regime on the care labor market? I will explain from the migration regime side and the care regime side. So next slide, please. So the first context is the migration regime. And as you can see, from 1 to 4, these are the labor migration channels. And this has been opened up since 2008. It started with this economic partnership agreement between Japan and the Southeast Asian countries. And the migrants came as like an attachment to this free trade agreement. And this was really the beginning where Japan started to have migrant care workers. And secondly, from 2017, there was a new visa category being created called long-term care to allow international students to undertake this certificate. They study for 2 years and then they get certified. And this allows them to stay for indefinite period of time. And thirdly, we have the technical internship trainee program, which is basically designed for technology transfer to the developing countries. So there were like agriculture workers or manufacturing factory workers, etc. But then in 2017, long-term care work was included in the occupational list. And basically, the idea is a training, but it has been used as like a disguise for cheap labor. And the fourth one was very recently created, specified skilled worker, and it's a labor migration program. But instead of abolishing or merging those different channels, it just has been created one after the other that creates like a fragmentation of the policy. And the reason is because Japan lacks the immigration policy. The political parties are not interested or rather reluctant to design a coherent migration policy. And also the care sector lacks political advocacy. Next slide, please. So here we have a very confusing situation where those 4 channels are run simultaneously with different aim, eligibility to apply, Japanese language level, and how they are recruited, the period of stay, and the salary. So these are creates a very fragmented picture. And as you can see, for the first wave, the economic partnership agreement, it has to be like a graduate of nursing or a graduate of a university. But the subsequent channels, the requirements are less demanding. And also Japanese language levels that are required are very different. And the recruiters brokers, the EPA was run by a government-to-government channels, but number 2, number 3, and number 4 has been run by private agencies. And the period of stay is also different. For EPA and international students, once they get the certificate, they can stay as much as they like. But for technical intern TITPs and SSWs, they are time-bound. And the salary is considered to be equivalent to Japanese. But of course, Japanese care workers work both as full-time and part-time. So it depends on which Japanese they are equivalent to. Next slide, please. So I will explain about how just the very beginning of how the migrants entered into the care labor market in Japan. They came under this economic partnership agreement, and they were mostly from the nursing background. And they got training in Japanese language for 1 year. And since it's a government-to-government program, no cost has been required for the migrants to pay. And they have to pass the national exam on care work within 4 years. And if they pass, the visa is renewable and they can bring their families. And by now, many are promoted to become leaders and managers in their own care facilities, and some have obtained the permanent residency. But the number is just too small because very high cost has been required by the government to subsidize those trainings. But this EPA care workers opened the path for migrants to enter the care sector, and it resulted in a positive acceptance of migrant care workers. Next slide, please. But after that, the deregulation of migration happened. The international students who will study in the Japanese caregiving school for 2 years, they have to pay the tuition fee and the living costs that will result in a huge debt, and they can work for 28 hours as a part-time work. And then for TITPs and the SSWs, it's a private brokerage, so they shoulder the debt and come to Japan. The contract is maximum 5 years, but actually many are from the nursing background. Next slide, please. Well, this is how the migration industry works between Japan and Southeast Asia. This is the case from the Philippines, and this one, TITP, is a private labor migration channel. So on the top, we have the Philippine government and the Japanese government who will license those sending agencies and accepting agencies in both countries. The sending agency in the Philippines will recruit, train, and dispatch the migrant worker. The accepting agency in Japan will match and accept and train the worker. But then the accepting agency will charge the care facility, that's the employer, to to pay for the tuition fee, and also they will charge something like $300 to $500 per month as like a monitoring and supervising fee. And this mechanism suppresses the wage of the migrant care workers because the care facility has to pay to the accepting agency as well as to the migrants. Next slide, please. And this is how the educational background, migration channels, and the status in the labor market has been entangled and connected. So we have 4 migration channels, but if you look at the educational background, those university graduates or nursing graduates can apply to EPA, but the slot is too small to accept everybody. So they have to look for other channels, and they will most likely to look for TITP or SSW. If you're a high school graduate, you have a choice between number 2, number 3, number 4, as well as without any educational background, you can also apply. But then if you look at the certified care worker, which allows you to stay and provide you with the citizenship, it's only the EPA and international students that will have access to it. And for TITP and SSW, theoretically, they are eligible to take the exam, but it's not really possible if you're working as a full-time. And then status in the labor market, this is how you end up. So some will work as full-time as a professional, the other as work as part-time supplementary worker. That will significantly affect their wages. Next slide, please. So now I will quickly go through the care regime, that is the long-term care insurance that will define how care has been organized in Japan. This insurance has been introduced in year 2000, and it's sort of modeled after Germany's long-term care insurance. But in Japan, we don't have any cash payment, so it's only the service being provided. And it's a public insurance and financed through tax and contribution. And the service providers are open to social welfare organizations, cooperatives, NPOs, and business. So here the business sector has been growing very rapidly, as I will show later. And the care needs are assessed by the care manager. So compared to like medical insurance, there is a ceiling that you can ceiling in the service that you can purchase. And we have licensed and unlicensed care worker. And actually, in the care sector, we have institutional care, daycare, and home care, but the migrants are only allowed to work in the institutional care. So we don't have any living care workers. Next slide, please. So once the long-term care insurance was introduced, the number of the care workforce has grown by 3-folds. But then also the number of the old age persons who need care also grew by 3-folds. And as you can see, the gap between the caretaker, the care receiver, and the caregiver has been growing. And by 2025, there is a need for 2.3 million care workers. Next slide, please. This is the average age of the Japanese care workers. It's not that the care sector is particularly aging, because the median age for Japanese is like 47, 48. But as you can see, the younger generations are decreasing. Next slide, please. And this is the labor shortage being felt by the care facilities. So when the EPA started, only like 30% of the care facilities were saying that they are in a shortage. But by 2017, more than 50% are expressing that they have a severe need in the care workforce. Next slide, please. And the number of the old age in institutional care, there are 2 types. One is institutional care under long-term care insurance. That means that the the financing of the care has been paid from the insurance, but there's also institutional care outside of the long-term care insurance, meaning that you have to pay from your own pocket. And here, the institutional care under long-term care insurance has grown stable, while as the number of the old age in the institutional care outside of the long-term care insurance has been growing rapidly as the government is trying to retrench the social expenditure. Next slide, please. So here is an interview with EPA care worker who are recruited in institutional care outside of the long-term care insurance, where Japanese staff has a high turnover ratio. So she for this EPA Indonesian care worker, she is already certified, so she has a freedom to choose wherever she wants to work, and she happened to be recruited in this institutional care outside of long-term care insurance. And she says that the Japanese staff are always talking about resigning, but the care business is expanding, so the care facility is aggressively recruiting TITPs and the students. They do not provide any training, so I pity on the elderly. So those earlier waves of migrants has been used to recruit further for those more deregulated migrants from their own countries. And marketization of care will be accelerated by the entry of large number of migrants under the deregulated channels. And TITPs and SSWs are paid minimum wage, as we have seen in the structure of the migration industry that will suppress their wages, that will downgrade the whole care work. Next slide, please. So if we look at the nexus between migration regime and the care regime, we have the issue of citizenship and the qualification. The vertical X shows the citizenship issue. There's a permanent residency on the top, the temporary residency on the bottom. And in the horizontal X, we have the qualification. So because the policy has been so much fragmented, we will have the people in the non-certified and temporary residence box, and this can only grow. But then if you look at the care facility as well as the well-being of the migrants, we should have more people in the permanent residency and the certified box. Next slide, please. So my conclusion is that the regional care chain for a call for the conceptualization of transformation of care on both ends of the chain. So we need to take a balance between the well-being of the elderly as well as the well-being of the migrants. But migrants will be stratified not because of their educational backgrounds, as we see, but due to the channel that they enter Japan. Different channels with different citizenship status results in relative deprivation among those from the same background. And it is only coincidental that the migrants will have all those information which is needed when they make the decision. So it'll be very difficult for them to have the whole picture of this different migration channels and the consequence of choosing a particular channel. So different channels for migrants to enter care sector will deteriorate the universal care provision, promote marketization of care outside of LTCI, and create a dual labor market. This will result in increased inequalities among women who are divided between paid and unpaid work and between native workers and migrants. So I argue that career paths should be provided so that standardization of care and access to career development will be ensured regardless of their entry channels. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Reiko. This was a very interesting presentation. This was our last presentation for today. So now we move on to our discussion by Li-Fang Liang. Li-Fang Liang is assistant professor at the Department of Sociology at the National Donghua University in Taiwan. As a feminist sociologist, she is interested in the invisible work mostly done by women. Her current research investigates how Indonesian migrant living care workers and their families left behind collaborate with each other to exchange care and sustain relationships in a transnational context. In particular, she is looking at how the use of information and communication technologies changes the form of care and the idea of family and distance. So, Li-Fang, please share your...
Okay, thanks. Yeah, thanks for the nice introduction. It's my pleasure to be the discussant for this interesting presentation. And I have two slides for my comments. I think it's easy for for you to follow. Okay, so I will start with the commonalities shared by these three presentations. In the context of globalized agent, many governments in the developed countries have incorporated migrant workers to solve the problems of care labor shortage. And the presentation today, they show us the important role of states in relation to recruiting migrant labor and shaping individuals' experience. And first, Hildegard and Reiko provide us the examples of Germany and Japan, respectively, to illustrate how the governmental policy divide migrant workers into different categories through regulations of their professional skills, their work visa, employment status, work condition, and so on. And the different policy of governments toward different types of migrant care workers also create the divided care labor markets and inequalities among different types of workers. And Hildegard's presentation, she pointed out the different types of care workers, including professional, live-out, and live-in, are associated with different level of precarizations. And among them, live-in care workers are most vulnerable. And Shereen and her colleagues' research provide us the concrete examples. And Reiko's presentations show us how the four types of migrant workers in Japan are subject to different migration policy and employment schemes. And the division result in the inequalities among workers, such as the periods of their stays, salaries, and their eligibility to apply for the permanent residency. And for the methodological or how these three research analyze their data. The presentations adopt intersectionality as the analytical approach to build upon their research. First, they show us the intertwinement of care region, migration policy, and employment policy of region, and how it affects work conditions and well-being of migrant care workers. And secondly, the presentation also demonstrates how the intersectionalities of social position where migrant workers are located, such as nationality, ethnicity, social class, gender, and so on, shape their migrant and work experience. Next, please. Okay, so I'll move on to the research. I'll move on to the questions for each presentation, and I'll start with the questions for the first presenter, Hildegard. And so in your presentations, you divide the home care service into three kinds of types. And so first questions is more about technical questions. So what does it mean by professional home care service in your presentation? Does it mean nursing care, and can it be covered by the care insurance in Germany? And the second question is how do because in your presentation you try to show us how the intersectionality between different regions and policies shape the different types of workers' working conditions. So my second question is, could you explain a little bit further how do state policy and the other structural factors facilitate different groups of migrants into different types of home care service? Okay, so now I move on to the question for Shereen's. So in your presentations, you show lots of details and informations based on the individual experience. And I think the data is so interesting. But the first question may a little bit go behind the scope of your presentation, but I'm wondering how does the state aid to regulate working conditions of living migrant care workers. For these first questions, I'm curious about the role of state played. And the second one, in your presentation, you also show us lots of binary boundaries in live-in care environments, such as informal, formal work, pay workers or family members, and so on. So could you explain why are the various boundaries in living care are often blurred? Okay, so now I'll move on to my final last two questions, and it's for Reiko. So the first one, in your presentations, you mentioned that you use the concept deregulations to describe the type 2, type 3, and type 4 workers' condition in Japan. But from my point of view, even for these three types of workers, it seems that Japanese government still involved in the process of their migration, or in the process of regulating their work conditions. So I'm wondering, what does it mean by deregulation, and why do you use this term to describe their work situation in Japan? And for the second one, I know lots of EPA workers in Japan. Most of them are university graduates, and they work as professional health care workers in their home countries. But in your presentations, you use the phrase upward mobility to describe the EPA workers' experience in Japan. But from my perspective, it's kind of downward mobility for them, because they work as the professional job before, but when they migrate to Japan, they have to work as kind of a semi-skill job in Japan. Okay, so here's my comments and questions for today's presenters. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Li-Fang. So perhaps if we could all come back to the room to kind of reflect on these questions. I don't know if you managed to write down your questions or if there's a way to keep that on. I don't know. So yeah, who would like to go first?
I can start. Or Shereen? It's okay.
Yeah, maybe if Shereen could start because she'll.
Okay.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Li-Fang, for the comments and your thorough kind of reflection. Your first question about how the state act to regulate work for migrant live-in care workers is a very important question. However, one of the things I want to start with is currently all live-in work is almost in a blind spot from regulation and from the framework of the provision of care. So there's quite a few complexities here. While the state, and that relates in part to how care is funded in the UK and in England in particular, because there are variations between England, Scotland, and Northern Ireland and Wales. So in England, it is a mixed market, and it's partially provided by the state. So the state only, kind of assess the eligibility of people, and this eligibility is both means tested, so on their amount of money they have, and also needs tested on the amount of needs, and it only funds a proportion where it meets both. However, under the Care Act, it has the local authorities, which is the local government. You can think about it, municipality, which has the kind of the power in the kind of commissioning services and making decision. They have a responsibility to provide information and coordination for everybody with needs. However, not everybody use this, and not everybody is even aware of this for the self-funders. So it becomes almost invisible to the state, and it becomes more of a family business. And also how the regulation and registration. So in England, there is no registration of care workers, unlike now we have it in Scotland and we have it in Wales. So basically, there is no register where you have all care workers registered. And when you come to domestic work, it's a private business between the person who is and their families and the individuals who's providing care. So if private arrangement happened with the intermediary of the local authority, then there is a responsibility to provide someone through an agency which is CQC regulated, and thus there is an overseeing of the contracts, of the training. There is responsibilities here. When it becomes a private arrangement, it's outside the regulation, and this is where the blurring, so it links actually to your next point as well, the blurring between the type of work that they are doing. Are they there just as helpers, as this, we know all the au pairs where you have little kids and you get someone like over summer students, and English students who stay with the family, do a bit of this, a bit of that. And we find with live-in care workers that they are actually confused exactly about what they are there, what's the expectations, and there is a clash between expectations. So they are coming to do care work. They are not coming to do cleaning or dog walking or gardening, but they end up doing these things because it is the interpretation of the private employer. And then you come to get the layer of also the self-employment, and that takes off even the responsibility, because if a service user is in receipt of cash payments from the state, the service users have a responsibility to provide training and to provide contract to the care workers. But if the care worker is self-employed, then it's not their responsibility. So there is a lot of precarity and lack of organization. And I think it needs to be changed, because obviously this is a growing significant part and there is a huge room for exploitation. And obviously the governments need to, different arms of the governments and different parts of the governments need to have sight on this and recognize this work. So it's a long way. It is invisible from different categories, and also because it relies on migrants who come through their own will. So there is no organization like a work permit or a route like Reiko was explaining. It relies on their own agency to choose and be employed in this type of work. Then it becomes a responsibility of the individual rather than the responsibility of the authority which have set up this route of employment. So that comes to the next question, which you asked, why are the various boundaries in live-in care blurred? And maybe I have explained a little bit about what does it mean to be working as a live-in care worker. So even the definition of the expectations from your point of view as a worker and the point of view of the service users can be different, and their family's interpretation also can be different. And then you get also the intermediary, which is a kind of platforms and online platforms, an introductory agency. So they are not employment agency. And the wording here is really important because it has legal connotations. So it's an introductory agency. It has no responsibility for employment rights. It only introduces people. It's almost like a dating site. You know, it just introduces these needs, and you go and arrange between yourselves. So this creates a lot of blurring. And even in the rights of what are my rights as an employee? Am I an employee? I'm a worker, or I am just agreeing to do certain things with that lot of money, and it doesn't matter how much I am employed, how much money I'm paid per hour. And how can I calculate my hours? If I'm working with a person with dementia and I'm up all night, what is my sleeping rate? What is my working rate? And then to complicate matters even further, it is the place of accommodation and place of work. And that really creates a lot of issues in these blurred ideas of what is work, what is my personal life, what I'm allowed to do, what I'm not. Am I going to be a friend to that person because they're asking me to go to parties, to take me to the club, to go to the bingo, to do this and this? So I become a companion, I become a friend. But I am not a friend because they have the authority, and their family has the authority to come and say, well, you haven't done your work. You've been doing such and such. And then this personal space, that I don't even have a space to stay at night. I do have a space. They offered me a space. It might not be up to standard, but I also have no control who will come. So a lot of users will refuse to have a lock on the door. They will be wandering at night. They will be opening the door. They will be calling them all the time. And these cameras and surveillance were common as well. So even in your own time, you're watched. Even if you are texting your family, you're watched. And we had some people talking about the family complaining that they were on their phone. But when are you going to do your own business? You know, when are you going to be yourself? So the blurred is the whole construct of being its grey economy, being outside of the space of the state vision and regulation, and becoming the responsibility and onus of the migrant worker who did this choice through migrant agency. So while in the literature, migrant agency is empowering and provides a tool for people to move on, it becomes disempowering in that case. So I hope that answers your questions. And I really enjoyed the other presentations as well. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Shereen. Thank you. Yes, Hildegard, if you'd like to answer Li-Fang's question.
I would also like to thank you for the interesting comments. It was very interesting and very inspiring for me to think about it, and also for questions. I will start with the first question about what are professional care services. I think here I came sometimes close to Shereen's answers. Professional care services in Germany are organized, regulated, and financed within the framework of insurances, of the long-term care insurance when it concerns bodily care or such personal care, and nursing care within the framework of healthcare insurance. So it's very strictly within this insurance framework. But as in the UK, because we have this structure of our long-term care insurance, which has an emphasis on family care, we only have some parts of care which is taken professionally. And we left a lot of care tasks to the families. And so the family started on their own. It was not a state policy. So the family started on their own to involve other actors in the care provision because they were not able to provide the care service any longer. And they employ live-out care workers to do household-related tasks, and these live-in care workers. And it was not organized by the state and not regulated by the state. It's a merge of the families. I think it's different in Asian countries, where the state is much more active. And then the state started to regulate this grey market, tried to do something, but it was not very successful, as I showed you. So that's the difference between these three parts. And if I look at the role of the state policies, I think it's important to say that for the starting point is the structure, because our long-term care insurance, with its ideas on family care, has structured or is a starting point for this emergence of these different distinct home care sectors. But if I go further, why are different categories of care workers are allocated to different sectors? In Germany, the professional system is very important. And skill labels are very important. That we can explain in contrast to Japan, but the background is the EU, of course, yeah, because most of our migrant care workers are living in EU countries, and the EU has regulated migration policies. So if you're a resident in a EU country, you have equal rights. Yeah, if you come to another country, you have equal rights, equal situations, and even the right to equal development opportunities. So it's not allowed, it's against the law to disadvantage residents from other countries. So we could never do it like Japan, yeah, to have these different channels, because our people have the right to be equal participants since 2011. So that's different. But still, we have this difference, of course, to third countries, where we mainly recruit skilled care workers, and then we have the professional system in Germany. That's very important. So in Germany, we have so strict regulations. If you would like to work, at least in home care, you need almost a training, and we have enough unskilled care workers in Germany. So we don't need actually care workers from other countries up until now. So that's at least in the home care sector. So the professional system is a very strict barrier. So I would also agree to Reiko at the end. So you need to open it up, this distinction, yeah, these distinct areas to have more mobility and have more opportunities. But in Germany, it would be important to offer people training opportunities, yeah, that they can make it to the other areas because they have the rights based on the migration policies. So mainly they are EU people in EU countries. So I hope I have answered the question. Thank you very much. And also thank you for all other presentations. I think they're very interesting, and I get very interesting ideas for my own presentation. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Li-Fang, for your interesting comments and questions. I will try to answer. The first question is about deregulation and why I call it deregulation. Japan has ratified the ILO Convention on recruitment policies, but then the Japanese state will only take care of the agency in Japan and will not care about the agency in the sending countries. And mostly what happens is that the migrants will be charged with those fees in their sending countries. And in some cases, they are charged more than they can pay. And that creates a huge problem, as you know. So, of course, compared to Japan has this long-term care insurance. So the kind of standardization has been taking place where you have the migrants in the care sector, but still you cannot control what is going on outside of the country. That's my first point. And then the second point is that the requirement for the migrants are very different compared to the EPA and the other migration channels. So for EPA, they had a very high requirements, but then for the other channels, in like the case of SSW, the fourth one, you just have to be older than 18 years old. So it's a huge difference in terms of their educational background and the capacity. So I think this, in that sense, I think we can call it deregulation. And I anticipate that it would be further deregulated, that currently the migrants can only work in institutional care, but I think sooner or later there will be more channels opening them up to work in home care sector, so that they would be further deregulated. And then for the second point, for regarding upward mobility, yes, you're right. Especially for the EPAs, they were nurses in their home countries, and they work as caregivers in Japan. So yes, it's a downward mobility in terms of skills. And I'm concerned about the WHO's guideline regarding the recruitment of healthcare workers from the countries where the medical professionals are scarce. So we need to take that into account. And so it's exactly what Rachel Paredes calls contradictory mobility, that when they come to Japan, they work as care workers. But then for EPAs, we also have a lot of returnees. And when they go back to their home countries, some will go back to nurse, but not many. And mostly they work in Japanese companies using their experience working in Japan. So that's another type of downward mobility. So I agree with you that it is a downward mobility altogether when we think about skills. But then when they come to Japan and they pass the national exam, they will have freedom to move. So some will go into nursing and some will get the permanent residence. So compared to the other migration channels that will not allow you to do that kind of movement, they are free to change their employers, and for permanent residency and family reunion, I think in that aspect, it is an upward mobility. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So if I don't know, perhaps we still have some time. So if you have any questions to each other, perhaps, then now there is an opportunity to ask.
I have
Yes.
Can I have another question? Oh, sorry. Just go ahead.
Do it. Okay. From my German then I would like to ask Reiko for Japan. You don't have services organized within private households, so your insurance covers everything. What's in your country? You don't have it.
Oh, we don't have living care workers, living domestic workers yet. And we do have dispatching domestic workers and home care workers who live out. But so far, we don't have the living care workers, maybe because the Japanese homes are too small. That's one thing. And the other thing is that the people will say that it's a cultural issue, that to have like a foreigner in your home is something that Japanese is quite reluctant to do.
But
so, yeah.
These live out care workers, they are organized by private households or by the insurance?
No, for the home care workers, they work for an agency. So it's like a dispatching agency that will coordinate everything. So in a way, it's all formal labor market, and it's under the long-term care insurance. But of course, since the long-term care insurance coverage has been shrinking, I think there will be more privatized care labor market growing in the future.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. So, Li-Fang? Yes, go ahead.
I have a very quick question about the entitlement to labor laws in Germany and Japan for migrant workers. Are they applied to the national labor law in your countries?
As in Germany, it's important that we are member state of the European Union, and we have this single market project, and you have the right to move to Germany and to get employed on same condition, equal conditions as the Germans. If you are living in EU member state, that's a big area. It's whole Europe. So I think that's a difference to Japan, because we have already an open labor market. Yeah. If you don't have it, if you live in a third country, we would say, if you're not in the EU member states, then we have specific agreements that we have with some countries as they can come. But because we have opened up our employment regulation 2013, you can apply. But then you have to be registered as nurse in Germany, or care worker, as skilled care workers. So this employment scheme of 2013 is only for skilled workers in general, in all areas of the labor market. And one area is care work, and then you can come, then you have to be registered. That means that your training has to be recognized as adequate training. You have enough German language skills, and so on and so on. Then it's different. then it's more regulated. But within the EU, it's more open because it's a common labor market.
And
Right.
on that note,
yes.
perhaps can I ask a question to
Sure.
Hildegard? So you mentioned, so Germany opened up the labor market in 2011 to the countries that joined the EU in 2004. So was there a difference? Was that a turning point in the living care market? By meaning, did it increase, or perhaps did it kind of become more regular because people who would do living care were kind of in the gray market before they were legally allowed to do it, kind of switched to more kind of organized and regulated forms of care, or there was not much difference?
No. I have to say it's of course easier for them because they are now legally in Germany, because they have a legal right to get employed. I think that's a difference for their own. But if you look at the employment situation, if you look at it's employment regulation, so now they could employ them based on the standard dependent employment scheme for private households, as all Germans. So it's no problem to employ someone in private households. But it's only rarely used, if I'm honestly. So we have some projects to use this scheme, but it's very only rarely used. And so, and the other, the EU regulations for the right of free movement or the temporary workers has been in place already before. And this is used already mainly by the agencies when they transfer people from these EU countries to Germany. But this has also been done before. I think that the difference is then what I told you at the end, that we find now in surveys that migrant care workers, live-in migrant care workers, say, at least the younger, say they use this type of employment to come to Germany and to look around, use it as a springboard to find employment in other areas of the German labor market. So they think it's only temporarily, some years, and then to find something better. That's their idea. So that is, of course, is possible because it's now a common labor market. It was not possible before. So on individual levels, they have now, at least they think, I don't know if they can realize it, but they think they have now better employment opportunities. And we have some projects, but it's only projects. We have a big non-profit provider who now tries, because we have really a gap or a shortage of skilled care workers, who tries to employ these live-in migrant care workers for regular daycare services. And they have organized employment that is suited to these live-in care workers. So, for example, they can work a lot of overtime work, and then they can move home and stay at home, and they get paid. So it's more that they just don't have the overtime work any longer. So of course that's a big difference. Before they also have this in Germany mainly 2 to 3 months, and then they moved home 2 to 3 months. And within this scheme now they can work 2 months with a lot of overtime and go home, live at home with their families, because as Shereen told us, it's attractive for them sometimes to go at home a period, but now they get paid because it's a part of their employment. So it's a big difference. So they try to do something, but it's mainly some providers. It's not really a big activity in Germany. But now, of course, we could improve the situation because it's now common labor marketing.
Okay, thank you.
Right.
Reiko, I think you were going to say something.
Can I ask?
Yeah.
I'm just wondering about this professionalization process that Hildegard has explained. So is it possible for the migrants to come as a very low entry level and then try to go up the ladder of those healthcare workers and eventually become like a nurse? Or is it not possible at all and the people will move out of the care sector? Or is there any system that supports that kind of career development ladder?
That's very difficult. At first, I have to say it's to move from the household, organized services, live in or live out, choose this professional service is very difficult. They give you some example where they try to do something, but it's an example. I think it's very difficult to move in there. To get yes, that's a big problem in Germany at all, to get professionalized if you are low-skilled care worker. As if you are a skilled care worker, of course, then you should, at least by law, should have the same development opportunities than the German national. So it's a law. Yeah? But if you don't have it, it's even for Germans difficult to get higher, to move to higher professional levels. It's very complicated in the German system. We're trying to change it now because we have this shortage of skilled care workers, and that in particular resulted in that we introduced some programs that now care workers in mainly in residential care services who have only low skilled 1 year or 2 years training, that they have now programs to get full financing, financed possibility to move to higher levels. That has started because we have this big shortage. I have no information if also the migrant care workers are included, but by law, if the people from EU member states have the same rights as the Germans, actually. But if they're included, I have no information on it. But it's in general difficult in the German system. Mm.
Thank you. Are there any more questions? If not, then perhaps we can wrap up, and then if you could, maybe it might be a good idea to go around and just if you could say what's your main takeaway point from this session. Who would like to start?
For me, it was very interesting that we have that when I compared, because I actually make comparative studies. Yeah, when I compare situation in Japan with Germany, it's so different because migration is another issue in Germany as in Japan, and polarization is another issue than in Germany. So it's very interesting that you have these differences. And I looked to Shereen, what she told us about living care work. It's very interesting to use this idea of boundaries. So the well-being, I've never heard it's interesting. But of course, the problem with boundaries we have also in Germany, that we have these unclear boundaries within the family.
Thank you.
Okay, I think it's really an interesting combination with Germany, UK, Taiwan, and Japan, because the way that the welfare state has been organized is pretty different. And also, the idea of the living care worker or the institutional care is also very different, and how we divide up between the institutional care and the home care is due to the social policy of each individual state, and how the migrants would become like an entry point into those different kind of systems that has been set up by the state makes a really good comparison. And yeah, I was just wondering about this idea of professionalization and the precarity, and that if you become professionalized, will there be a less chance of becoming vulnerable and end up in a precarious situation? So yeah, that's why I asked the question about the skills, and which is very relevant to us too. And also the question of the boundaries, and especially within this physical space, that how do you create your boundaries is really a fascinating question. So I really enjoyed all the presentation and the comment by Li-Fang. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Just
Li-Fang,
Okay.
would you like to say a few words? Yeah.
Yeah, just very briefly, as a discussion for this panel, I learned a lot from of your presentation, especially through the comparison between different countries. Nowadays in Taiwan, we also have a huge number of migrant care workers coming from Southeast Asian countries, but most of them are working in private home. Yeah, so and your presentation also remind me it's very important to it's very important to adopt the approach of intersectionality, and to intertwine the different regions of such such as care regions, migration region, and employment regions. So thank you.
Thank you very much then, everybody, and thank you everyone for listening to our session. So goodbye.
Okay.
Bye.